This is What If the Kamado Siblings Parted Ways Part 6 Chapter 6. Link in description. Hope you like the fanfic What If, and if ya do then like, comment, and subscribe for more. Start Chapter 6. Chapter 6, The Demon Assassins. Tanjiro Kamado stood in the middle of the empty road, facing the two demons before him, blade raised and eyes narrowed. First, there was Yahaba, the one with the closed eyes and the orange haori, while the one who stood before him was Susumaru, the girl with the paintbrush-like hair and a tamari ball in her hand. She'd just drawn back her arm in preparation to throw the projectile at him, her muscles bulging before she sent the ball flying. Followed quickly by manifesting another one in her free hand and quickly tossing that at him as well. Focused on the projectiles, Tanjiro sidestepped the first one and decided to try and cut through the second one with a horizontal slash, only for it to bounce off his blade, knocking his sword off to the side and leaving him open for the first tamari, which bounced off a wall and returned to him. Tanjiro in turn only dodged that due to putting use to his momentum and side flipping to evade the ball. Susumaru meanwhile raised her hand to catch the tamari that nearly hit him while donning a shit-eating grin. "Look at that, the little demon slayer can't even cut through a children's toy," she mocked him. "I knew him killing a former demon moon was dumb luck." With the ring of a bell, another tamari would then form in her free hand. "Now let's see how long you last before I break you, okay?" She threw the two balls again, and Tanjiro would narrow his eyes, watching both attacks closely. He leaned back further and further to dodge the first attack, letting it fly right overhead once again, this time though with the intention to observe it closely. So that's what it is. He planted his free hand on the ground, using it as support to backflip to his feet as the first ball passed him by, thus recovering in time to face the second one. "Watch for the angle of its rotation. And swing your sword against it." He brought down his blade then, and easily cut through the tamari, its rotation aiding his blade in the slicing process rather than hindering it this time. With that figures, he would quickly spin around in time to meet the first temi as it bounced back to him and slash it apart with a horizontal swing. Both cut balls fading into nothing before they could even bounce off the ground again. He then turned to look at Susumaru, raising an eyebrow as if asking, "Is that all?" To which the demon snarled, "So the monkey can learn, huh?" "Big deal." Two more tamari formed in her hands. "Let's put that bravado to test." She threw the two, before forming another pair and also tossing them before doing so a third time as well. Tanjiro though breathed in deeply, focusing intently as he gripped his blade as the first tamari reached him. One by one, with a series of precise swings, he cut down ball after ball, always slicing against its rotation. All six were sliced in half and faded away, while Tanjiro stood there, twirling his sword as his lips twisted into a small smirk. "What was all that about, breaking me, again?" Susumaru glared at him from behind her grin, as Yahaba behind her only frowned slightly. "You brat. You think a few lucky swings make you hot shit?" she snarled, removing the top of her kimono then, leaving herself only in a black undershirt. "Fine then. Enough with fooling around." Clenching her fists, suddenly four more arms would burst from the demon's torso then, leaving her with three at each side, each of them manifesting a tamari in their palms. "From now on, I'm throwing to kill." Deeply inhaling again, Tanjiro stepped forward, preparing to move in for the kill himself. "Breath of the sun," he murmured to himself, "first dance. Waltz." His white blade burst with bright flames just as Susumaru cocked her arm back to toss in the first tamari, and Tanjiro would dash forward. He didn't focus on striking the incoming balls against their angle of rotation this time, as the moment his blade even grazed it, fire would consume the tamari and burn it away in moments, his breath style nullifying the demon's blood art much to her chagrin. The first two balls would come at him rather straightforwardly, being both cut and burned away completely unceremoniously. The next two were sent at Tanjiro in quick succession, aiming to catch him off guard, only he slashed both of them with a single fiery swing. With only two tamari left and a demon slayer quickly approaching, Susumaru nervously tried for a trick shot, flinging the tamari so it would bounce from wall to wall and strike Tanjiro on the side, only for him to see this coming and leap directly over it, the very tip of his blade being stretched out to graze the ball and set it aflame as well. He then landed before her with a flip. He was close though, which was in a way both a blessing and a curse. Susumaru already had her last Tamari at the ready to throw, and at this distance, he wouldn't be able to get a proper swing to cut through it. Dodging it would be hard too, due to its sheer speed. That only left him one option, and when the demon threw in her last Tamari, he rushed in and thrust his blade forward, the tip piercing right through the ball and setting it aflame. Turning it to ash before the sword even reached Susumaru's shoulder, impaling the demon through it. Tanjiro had switched his blade to a diagonal angle before it stabbed into the demon, intent on pulling his blade to the side and, with one swung, fully decapitating the first of his two targets. For a moment he thought this might not be as hard as he thought it would be, and he watched the panic in Susumaru as he began swinging the flame-covered katana to decapitate her. Only for his delusion to be cut short as Yahaba raised his palm, revealing the eyeball on it. "That's enough," he said as the eye in his hand blinked, and just as he went for the kill, an invisible force would drag Tanjiro back violently. He hit a wall and bounced off the ground before coming to a stop, further away from the two demons than he even started in, the flames in his sword fading as his concentration was broken. What was that?" The demon slayer groaned, rising somewhat groggily. He just raised his hand, and I was thrown back. He looked over at the second demon. "What exactly is his blood art?" "I think that's enough playing around now, Susumaru," Yahaba told his partner as she covered the closing wound on her shoulder with one of her hands while glaring at the demon slayer. "I can see now why Master wanted us to eliminate this human. We must combine our techniques and prioritize his eradication." "Yeah, this one is trouble," Susumaru admitted with a slightly pained groan. "Those flames of his are somehow slowing down my regeneration. We can't let him get too close again." She raised one of her arms in the uninjured side and a Tamari would appear in her palm with the ring of a bell, not to say I'm ready to give up my fun yet. Though, the fact that he managed to stab me just makes me want to kill him even more slowly. "Fine, I suppose that's good enough." Yahaba sighed then, raising his hand as well, the eye on his palm wide open. Susumaru threw in the ball at Tanjiro full force, just as the eye blinked, and Tanjiro would note that the ball would get just a bit faster as it did so. Can he repel objects? Push them back? Is that what he used to get me away and make the Tamari faster? He shook his head, raising his katana in preparation to slice the projectile. It doesn't matter. Relying on empty guessing now will only get you killed. Just swing for the ball and be prepared for anything. So that's what he did, reading the Temari's rotation and bringing down his sword to slash it. Except, rather than connecting as it had done every other time, the ball instead swerved just slightly to the left at the last moment, escaping the edge of his blade and moving to hit his arm with enough force to leave him short of that limb. He widened his eyes though, and moved to the side at the last moment, receiving only a graze on the upper end of his arm, though nonetheless a fairly deep one. The Tamari would fly past him, but rather than following a straight path, it would do an arc in midair, as if controlled by an invisible force, and return aiming to strike him right in between his shoulder blades. Tanjiro turned in time though, and managed to cut it down before it could reach him. He's not just repelling it. He realized then, grunting as he felt blood dripping down the wound in his left arm. He's controlling its trajectory somehow. Breathing deeply, he turned to look at the two demons then, just as Susumaru produced 3 more Tamari in her hands. I can see why they were sent out together. These two's techniques definitely make for the worst possible combo. He really is fast, Susumaru remarked with a small smirk. Didn't think he'd be able to cut that one down. Let's take this up a notch again. 3 Tamari then appeared in her palms. While Yahaba turned as if looking at her briefly despite his closed eyes, wearing a scowl on his face. Nonetheless, he turned back twice the demon sayer before them, and raised both his palms, the eyes in them opening as the arrows in their pale orange irises shifted around. The Tamari were thrown in quick succession, while Yahaba's eyes each blinked twice. Tanjiro on the other hand closed his eyes for a deep moment and focused through the pain from his wound. This was probably his toughest fight so far, and he knew that. Should he make the slightest mistake now, it would cost him his life. But that was what he trained so long and so relentlessly under his master for, as well as the breathing techniques he'd learned. He started taking a shallow breaths to reinforce the muscles around his injury and greatly diminish the bleeding. With his wound remedied for time being, he waited for the right moment. His breath grew deeper as he tightened his grip on the katana and shifted his stance. Breath of the sun, fourth dance, he chanted, burning sunrise triple. He swung his katana in an upwards arc much like he'd done against the swamp demons as its edge was engulfed in flames. Except this time not only was he able to perform the technique properly due to not being underwater where he had no footing, but used a stronger variation of the technique where he used the momentum of his upward swing to repeat the process twice over, one from his left and one from his right, creating 3 intersecting arches of fire before him. This though only managed to burn up 2 of the Tamari, as Yahaba had one suddenly changed course as it moved over Tanjiro and his blade and took a dive aiming to hit one of his legs. The Demon Slayer was able to leap in and dodge at the last moment, spinning sideways midair and giving himself the momentum needed to catch the ball once it arched again and flew at him, slashing through the ball as well with his white blade. With the threat of the Tamari handled, Tanjiro would stand there for a moment, panting. The breath of the sun was unquestionably powerful, but it was also draining to its user. And using such a strong technique after his earlier waltz had taken quite a bit off him. Nonetheless, he moved to dash in at the demons before they could unleash another attack upon him, only for Yahaba to suddenly smirk as the Demon Slayer was swiped off to the side by an invisible force, crashing roughly against the wall of a nearby house. "What?" Susumaru exclaimed angrily, turning to her partner. "Yahaba, I told you I'd get to finish this one off. You can't just go stealing my kills like this. You were taking too long to finish him." "I'm not one to take risks," Yahaba told her, raising his hand. "Besides, you can't still be the one to throw in a final blow. I just made him an easier target, that's all." "Damn it. It's that one's power." Tanjiro grunted, struggling to rise. "How can I possibly dodge something I can't even see?" Seeing that though, Yahaba would snarl, "Oh, no you don't." The arrow iris on his palm rotated, and Tanjiro would begin being skyward by the invisible force. "Come on, Susumaru, take him out now." Fine, you're so impatient," she grumbled, producing another Tamari as the Demon Slayer was dragged up high. "I'll just hurry up and kill him then." She cocked her middle left arm back, buffing it up before swinging it to throw the ball at the entrapped Tanjiro to meet his upwards trajectory, who in turn only looked nervously at what he was being dragged towards, and could only raise his blade, prepared to use another breath of the sun technique to get rid of the ball despite already being drained by the 2 previous instances. But he was interrupted by doing so when he was distracted by an unexpected smell. Why do I smell flowers?" He wondered momentarily, before he caught a black and white blur in the corner of his vision, and next he knew. Yahaba's outstretched hand had been lopped off at the wrist. He felt the invisible force tugging at him disappearing, dropping him while he was midair and causing the Tamari to miss. He'd begin to fall to the ground, but would manage to land on one of the rooftops and roll to diminish his impact, before falling down the roof into the ground somewhat roughly. Once he'd regained his bearings, he would look up and notice he was standing a good distance away from the demons, and they were looking at surprise, but not at him, rather at something next to him. Curious, Tanjiro would turn to look as well, and widened his eyes as he found the source to the scent of flowers. Standing beside him was a girl just about his own age, with black hair fading to pink at the tips tied by a green butterfly ornament. She had a short and seemingly delicate physique, but Tanjiro knew better. From the dark uniform she wore under a white cloak or the pink Nichiren blade she held before her, it was easy to identify the girl as a demon slayer. "Can you stand?" she asked him calmly, facing the demons with her katana raised. Tanjiro paused, but nodded as he grunted while standing up beside the girl, observing her keenly. Regardless, since it was obvious she was on his side after she'd saved him by maiming Yahaba, he decided to waste no time and just share with her what he knew so she wouldn't be caught off guard. The female demon can produce those balls and use them as projectiles. They can bounce around and have enough strength to blast right through you, so be careful. The male one has some ability that allows him to control the trajectory of things every time he blinks the eyes on his hands. He can apparently Combine that with the first one's Tamari, but there's no way to predict their trajectory. The girl raised an eyebrow at that though. Does that mean you cannot see the arrows? Tanjiro blinked. Arrows. That demon is creating arrow projectiles and controlling their direction with those eyes. He can seemingly attach those to objects and people, like he did with you, or those Tamari. She said, leaving Tanjiro somewhat confused. If what this girl was saying was true, then how come he couldn't see these arrows she was talking about? One look at Yahaba though and he knew this wasn't an empty guess on her part. This girl, where did she come from? He asked, angered and confused as his maimed hand regenerated. She can somehow perceive my Katetsu arrows. It doesn't matter, we'll just blow her apart all the same, Susumaru announced impatiently, forming 2 more balls, one on each middle hand, and tossing them both towards the 2 demon slayers in one go. Tanjiro raised his blade, ready to defend himself, only for the girl to step past him, raising her hand as if silently asking to leave this to her. She raised her katana with a single hand, and as the Tamari approached, she'd narrow her eyes before, with 2 swift swings from right to left and left to right, easily slicing apart the 2 balls without the slightest difficulty. Seeing that demonstration, Tanjiro could only blink in surprise. She's good. Susumaru meanwhile backed up, surprised herself at how easily the girl had dealt with her Tamari, easier still than the boy did. Yahaba meanwhile only scowled angrily. Susumaru, these 2. Yes, I know. The Tamari demon growled irritatedly as she raised all her hands, and a remark formed in each of them, they are definitely trouble. We gotta get rid of them before they get another chance. Glad to see we're on the same page for once, he admitted, raising both his palms and the eyes in them. Tanjiro stood beside the girl silently, both breathing in with their blades raised while both the demons standing across from them had their hands raised ready to use their blood demon arts at the first movement. The 2 parties seemed locked in a standoff, waiting for the first sign of movement. The stalemate seemed to last longer than the few seconds it actually did, building tension until it was near unbearable. Which was exactly when Susumaru grinned, swinging her arms to start sending her Tamari flying while Yahaba's eyes blinked multiple times, responded by the girl dashing the moment she did so, Tanjiro following close behind. And thus chaos broke out again. Kanao Tsuyuri had made her movement the moment she saw the Tamari demon. Susumaru, from what she'd heard, dragged her arm back ready to let loose one of her deadly Tamari, followed by the arrow demon behind her, Yahaba, blinking his eyes and producing the same red arrows that she'd seen before, which raced in and pierced through the Tamari, taking control of its momentum and trajectory. It zigzagged across the air, trying to create a pattern she couldn't predict, but with the arrow there, it made its changes in direction obvious to her. It would try and catch her in the head from the side, but her blade was there to intercept it, slashing against its momentum to cut through the ball with the utmost ease. These 2 had tricky abilities, and against a normal demon slayer, might make for a near impossible fight to beat. But she was no average demon slayer, she was a Suguko, trained by one of the pillars themselves. It was nothing she felt prideful about if she even felt anything about it at all, but there was a sense of obligation that came with that title. Not to mention, her sense of sight had always been different since she'd been young, able to perceive things the normal human eye would usually miss. With her training, that natural advantage had only been heightened even further, to the point where sensing the rotation of the Tamari so to optimize her slashes or seeing those Katetsu arrows posed little issue. Oh, and there was also the fact that she wasn't alone. The other demon slayer, the boy in red. She'd taken note of him back in the final selection, but while he seemed far stronger than your usual Mizunoto, she still didn't see him as much of anything special. Somehow though, he'd gotten himself in a situation against demons far more powerful than the one she was hunting, so it was her duty as a fellow demon slayer to aid him in their eradication. 3 more Tamari were sent then in quick succession, all taken and redirected by those red arrows produced by Yahaba. Her purple eyes darted from left to right and back, calmly following the trajectory of the Tamari as she went before leaping at the right moment to flip in between the 3 projectiles while swinging her blade to cut the bottom one down. Those, though, arched over and redirected themselves to her back as she landed, while 2 more arrow-controlled Tamari were thrown at her by the 2 demons. For a moment, Kamado would find herself surrounded by the deadly projectiles all around her, but before she could even figure out how to deal with those, the boy would jump in, slashing one of the ones at her back during the brief moment it stopped midair to take a sharp turn. If nothing else, she had to admit he was perceptive to pick up on something like that. It was probably how he'd managed to survive against these 2 for so long before she arrived. Landing beside her, the 2 would alternate in cutting down the remaining Tamari. That including him ducking so she could slice down a Tamari headed for his head, her sidestepping when he brought down his blade to cut one aiming for her head and, lastly, her planting a hand on his shoulder and using it as leverage to flip herself over him and slice down the last of the Tamari. Not only was he perceptive, it seemed, but he'd managed to read her movements and react near perfectly. She was now beginning to wonder if the boy really had more to offer than she'd initially gave him credit for. Thedamons however wasted little time while their opponents moved around their attacks, and Susumaru manifested 6 more Tamari, bouncing them off the ground and high into the sky 2 at a time. Once they were all sky high, she'd form 6 more and fling them all at the demon slayers while Yahaba used his arrows to take control of the falling Tamari, creating a barrage of 12 deadly projectiles, 6 of them having their trajectory manipulated by Yahaba's arrows. Seeing that, Kamado widened her eyes slightly, and pushed back her ally, giving her the space to take a deep breath and utilize one of her techniques. Breath of Flower, second form, she called out, getting into a stance. Plum Spirit. Kamado then began a series of defensive sword swings, still careful not to harm the boy now standing behind her. While this managed to defend her from a few of the Tamari though, she would quickly notice that the barrage of attacks was far too big for her technique alone to uncover. She'd grit her teeth, trying to extend its length, but would only eliminate 5 of the Tamari thrown at her before she was forced to lower her throbbing arms and pause her defense. She breathed in, getting ready to repeat the technique to try and eliminate the other Tamari still heading from them, only 2 of which were still being controlled by the arrows. Yet, before she could, the boy would land before her, having a technique of his own seemingly readied as his sword had burst into powerful flames, Breath of the Sun. He called out fiercely, gripping his hilt tightly, third dance, Crimson Mirror. She'd watch as he swung his blade defensively in numerous diagonal, horizontal and vertical swings that ultimately created a net of fire around him, one that intercepted the remaining Tamari, the bright flames burning them away to ash as they made contact with the flames. The Breath of the Sun. Kamado mused, watching the flames before her fixedly. Those flames. They are different from Lord Rengoku's. Just who is this boy? With the technique finished, he would lower his katana with a slight tremble to his grip, letting out some heavy panting. Whatever it was that breath he'd used, it had obviously taken a toll on him. She'd moved past him quickly to intercept another ball already sent out at them by a relentless Susumaru as the demon saw a chance to take her tired ally down. Kamado wouldn't let her though, as she cut down the Tamari aimed for the boy, briefly turning to meet his panting gaze, and receive a small nod of gratitude as he rose with a slight struggle beside her. With that, both would dash in to meet the barrage of attacks sent at them. The controlled balls twisted and turned in the air, but Kamado nonetheless cut them down. With the boy covering her back in their advance for any arrow-controlled Tamari, Yahaba tried to sneak past them. Quickly, they began closing distance, and Susumaru angrily swung her arm to fling 3 more of her Tamari at the 2. Kamado would swiftly dodge the first 2, mirrored by the boy following her lead, and bring down her blade in a vertical swing at the last one, twisting her blade to the side just as it was midway through slicing the ball so both its divided halves would harmlessly fly in opposite directions over her shoulders. Now face to face with the 2 demons, time would seem to slow down as Kamado would move in for the decisive blow, swinging her blade in a feint towards Susumaru, causing the Tamari demon to fall back while creating 3 more balls in one set of arms and blasting the human with 2 at point blank. The Subuko would jump however, over Susumaru and towards her real target, the arrow demon, Yahaba. The balls meanwhile only bounced off the ground, raising quite a bit of dust and messing with the visibility of most present, except Kamado and her enhanced sense of sight. That is not to say Susumaru didn't realize what was happening, and quickly prepared to throw her last ball at Kanao while she was midair, and properly eliminate the troublesome demon slayer. Only she never noticed the other one jumping through the cloud of dust, his white blade slashing the ball before it could even leave her hand, alongside most of her fingers. This also allowed the boy to use the demon's momentary sense of distraction and planting a foot on her shoulder to trampoline himself after Kanao while throwing Susumaru off her balance. Yahaba too didn't remain inactive, raising his hand at her as the eyes in both palms blinked several times, unleashing numerous arrows towards Kanao while she moved at him. Clearly intending on having all the Katetsu arrows he produced intersect by attaching themselves to her body and pulling at different directions to tear her apart. Seeing through as much, the Suguko would widen her eyes in a small moment of panic as she tried to figure out how to escape the arrows, only to notice a presence behind her. Noticing the red-clad demon slayer boy who'd followed her in her leap. Despite the urgency of the moment, both would meet their gazes then, his arm reaching forward as if extending a hand, and there would be a silent understanding between the two. Kanao planted one of her feet onto her fellow demon slayer's outstretched palm, and used that as a platform to jump right over the arrows before they intersected on her. Though in the process one of them would latch itself onto the boy and quickly drag him away from them. His job was done though, and the extra impulse allowed Kanao was able to flip in between the Katetsu arrows sent at her, bringing her blade down to land a vertical cut through Yahaba's outstretched palm, cutting through its eye and causing most of the conjured arrows to fade away. Clenching his cut hand into a fist, he would growl, "You impertinent brat!" he cried out, stretching out his other hand towards the demon slayer ready to try and rip her apart with another few of his arrows, but he was too slow. "Breath of the flower, first form," Kanao called out after a deep breath, her blade seeming to glow in a bright pink light. She rose and brought it with her in an upwards diagonal slash that cut through the arm Yahaba was extending before reaching his neck and slicing that clean off as well. He would even open his normally closed eyes in shock, and see the light in Kanao's pink blade breaking apart into pieces that surrounded them as it mixed in with his blood to create a darker red. Reminiscent of falling petals in the spring, crimson rose petals. Susumaru would watch that whole demonstration, eyes widening in brief shock before it was replaced by anger. "You bitch!" she snarled, spinning around and forming 3 tamari in her left set of arms, preparing to send them all flying at Kanao all at once while she was still in a vulnerable position, which would make dodging all 3 balls at once a very difficult task. Fortunately, it never came to that, as the moment the remaining demon raised her arms ready to send her tamari flying, she would suddenly find herself unable to as all 3 of her left arms were slashed off at the elbow. Susumaru turned around quickly then, and would only get a brief glance at the shadowed visage of the crimson-clad swordsman behind her before he swung, his blade biting onto her neck and also decapitating the tamari demon. With both demons slain, the boy could only stand there, watching the girl and panting in exertion as the 2 demons beside them faded into ash, while Kanao herself would sheath away her blade before she turned to look at him as well. It took an awkward moment of silence between the two before he broke it. "So who are you, anyway?" A few minutes later, Tanjiro would find himself sitting on a bench in the town square, half shirtless after removing his haori and lowering the left half of his white kimono shirt, allowing the girl that currently sat beside him to treat the injury he'd received from the tamari demon. She was currently applying a balm of sorts to his wound, and there the 2 stood in silence as she did so, the only thing breaking that being the occasional wince from Tanjiro. As he'd find out shortly after the battle with the demon assassins, the girl's name was Kanao Suyuri, and he did recognize her from the final selection. Not many words had been exchanged since then though, as she'd only offered her medical services in treating his wound, and now there they stood, practically silent ever since. Feeling a bit awkward with that though, Tanjiro would soon try and strike up some conversation of sorts with the girl. "So, why are you here in this village anyway?" he asked. "Doesn't seem like a prime spot for demon hunting." Kanao only narrowed her eyes slightly, not even staring up from the wound she was treating. "Evidently our experience today shows otherwise," she noted, to which he looked away slightly. But she continued nonetheless, but to answer your question, I was searching for a demon said to have been kidnapping young women in this village. I don't think either of those two fit the description quite right though. Ah. Well, that's because I took that one down. Tanjiro explained to her, before pausing somewhat cautiously and continuing, whatever those two were doing here today. It was probably something unrelated. Yes, I thought so. Kanao admitted as she finished applying the balm to his wound, beginning then to envelop his upper arm in bandages. You seem like quite the talented demon slayer, after all. He blinked, not fully sure of how to reply to the compliment. Oh, thanks. You don't need to thank me. She immediately replied, not even turning her eyes away from his wound. I simply made an honest evaluation of your abilities. Were you weak, I also wouldn't hesitate in telling you so. Right, he replied, finding it surprisingly hard to even do something as striking a casual conversation with this girl in all her monotony. I still do owe you for helping me out with this injury though. Actually, you don't, Kanao said, very matter-of-factly. All I am doing is pertaining to the bigger success of the Demon Slayer Corps. Be it stepping in to help you in a fight, or even aiding your healing is to make sure you can recover and return to demon slaying at your fullest abilities in the shortest time possible. Yeah, this girl is really hard to talk to. Tanjiro realized in a sweat drop. Maybe it was best to just keep quiet. He knew, after all, that two demons working together like the ones they fought today was already enough to raise some eyebrows. He couldn't let her know those two were after him and risk getting the corp's attention like that. And yet, something compelled him to keep talking. You're very strong too. He noted, but you're somewhat different from the other demon slayers I've met. It's like you. He drifted off. Yes, Kanao asked, looking up at him then as if pushing him to continue. It's like you have less of a drive. He explained, everyone seems so intent to bring down demons for their own personal reasons, but for you, it seems just like any other job. Just going through the motions. She narrowed her eyes then, perhaps you're right. Demon slaying is just like any other job for me. She admitted, it is easier that way though, not having to make decisions. Just find a demon, and then kill it. In the end that is really all it amounts to. Hard choices aren't much of a problem, as long as you follow the protocols. He raised an eyebrow at that. Why would choices be such a big problem? Maybe they aren't for you, but for me, nothing matters. Kanao said, as if that was the most natural thing, and if nothing matters, there is no reason for me to have to choose anything. Tanjiro would pause at hearing that, staring at the girl beside him for a moment of silence. He tried to think of something to say, but before he even did, she'd finished with his bandages. Well, it's done. Kanao said then, rising to her feet, this shouldn't take too long to heal now. But I imagine it will leave a scar. Right. Thanks for that, he said, somewhat distantly as he stared at his bandaged arm. Like I said already, there is no need to thank me. This is all part of the job. She repeated herself, and though he himself had said something similar before, it seemed very different to Tanjiro when she said it. It was indeed part of the job, but that wasn't to say it didn't matter. There was a very real chance he wouldn't have survived that fight weren't it for her. Since there is no further need for me here, I should head off. My sister probably awaits me, and she would be annoyed if I took too long. With that said, Kanao would bow her head briefly to him and start walking off. She would only go so far though, as Tanjiro looked at the ground hesitantly before calling out, wait. She turned to look at him then, head tilted, yes. Is something wrong? Quote. He looked at the ground for another moment before turning to her, before you go, can I ask you a question? Kanao looked at him somewhat curiously then, let's see. Rather than just answering though, she'd reach out for a coin off her pocket before flipping it upwards into the air. And catching it in her palm again before turning to him, all right, go on. Tanjiro blinked in surprise. Did she just flip a coin to decide if she'd answer? And she didn't even check it, so how? He shook his head, no. Just focus on the question itself. Turning to look at her firmly then, the swordsman would ask, if you are so indifferent about everything, why did you become a demon slayer of all things? Kanao paused, seemingly surprised by the question, the biggest show of emotion Tanjiro had even seen from her so far. She seemed to mull it over for a moment, before answering, I don't remember feeling almost anything ever since I was little. Back then, my family was very poor, and my parents were cruel. The only feelings I knew then were hunger, pain and sadness. And then, one day, I felt like I'd had too much, and it all just suddenly stopped. From then on, I stopped feeling those things. I stopped caring, she told him, to which his eyes widened. I remember thinking this was good. That this nothingness was much better compared to what I had before. I didn't even get upset when my family sold me to slavery. She looked up then, as if reminiscing about something. That was when I first met my older sisters. They managed to get me from the slaver and raised me in a new home, and yet I never felt anything. Both my sisters were demon slayers, so naturally, I was trained by them to become one myself. I've been slaying demons since then, and I never felt anything over it. It was always a simple job. Find the demon and chop its neck, rinse and repeat. Until, she reached out for the back of her head and untied the butterfly ornament in her hair, letting it fall down to her back, before holding the ornament in her hand while staring at it intently. Big sister Kanae was killed by a demon 2 years ago. That was the first time in many years that I ever felt anything. I couldn't bring myself to cry, but I was sweating so much, all the while trying to come to terms that I would never see my sister, my mentor, ever again. That feeling, that horrible feeling, it is not the reason I became a demon slayer, but it is the motivation that keeps me in my path as one. I do not want to feel that feeling ever again, and I do not want anyone else to feel that feeling either. The feeling of seeing someone close to you disappear. And I know that demons aren't the only ones that take people's lives suddenly like this. But if by doing this I never have to see my sister or one of the girls at the estate disappear, then I know I am doing the right thing by being a demon slayer. After all, the decision to keep going in this job is the only one I am certain of. With that all said, she'd tie her hair back with the butterfly ornament before turning to Tanjiro. Does that answer your question, Tanjiro Kamado? Tanjiro blinked then, shaken out of a daze by her question. Yeah. Yes, it does. Kanao nodded, though a bit absent from the moment. In that case, I believe we're truly done here. She said, farewell and until we meet again. With that, she jumped off to the nearest rooftop and started making her way out of the village, leaving Tanjiro by himself at the bench. He would sigh, raising the lowered half of his kimono shirt back over his half-bare chest and his bandaged arm. Its long sleeve still bearing a large red spot dripping down its length from the blood he'd lost. Honestly, he didn't expect the girl to spill her guts out to him in the way that she did, but if Kanao truly didn't care about almost anything, it didn't seem so out of character to tell all that to someone she'd just met. He leaned back on the bench to stare up into the sky at the crescent moon, now lower in the sky than it had been when he last looked at it. His lips twitched into a small grimace when he felt himself leaning against his injured arm, and shifted his weight over to the other one as he continued staring up. What an odd girl, he mused to himself, still thinking about Kanao, though I can't say she wasn't pretty. Days later, in another location entirely, a petite young woman walked through the halls of a mansion. Her shoulder-length hair that faded from black to dark purple was tied together with a white and purple butterfly ornament, and over the demon slayer uniform. She donned a white haori with patterns similar to that of butterfly wings. This was Shinobu Kocho, the demon slayer's insect pillar, and as she made her way through the corridor, she couldn't help but mull over the recent talk she'd had with her younger sister. Finally, she'd take a left through a slide door and arrive in her destination, a wide-open room with only 3 walls. The fourth leading to an opening of a beautiful inner garden with numerous trees and a pond. Sitting at the edge of the room seemingly watching the garden, was a man with his back turned to Shinobu, his shoulder-length black hair being all one could see from her position. Approaching the man, Shinobi would stop just some 10 feet away before falling down on a single knee. Lord Ubuyashiki, she said, prostrating herself before the leader of the Demon Slayer Corps. Kagaya Ubuyashiki would smile, not that she could see as much. Good afternoon, Shinobu. He greeted the young woman, his voice as serene and calm as ever. To what do I owe the pleasure of your company on this beautiful day? Shinobu narrowed her purple eyes somewhat worriedly. I've asked to meet you to discuss something my sister has reported to me just earlier today as she returned from a mission. Ah, Kamado. I've heard she's been doing a splendid job as an official demon slayer since passing her final selection. He noted. What did she tell you about, then? Well, she was sent off to hunt what seemed to be a demon kidnapping girls in a small town. But instead upon arriving there she encountered another young demon slayer she recognized from her final selection facing off two other demons who were fighting together against him. Together, you say? Kagaya inquired thoughtfully. Demons are not usually the type to work together like that. Unless, that is, if they're ordered by their master himself. But of course, there's no reason for someone like Muzan to worry about a single low-ranked demon slayer. Well, that's not all, actually. Shinobu admitted, there was something about the demon slayer. Kamado said he was strong, but what was really curious about it was that she'd never seen the breathing style used by him before. She said he was using the breath of the sun. There was an immediate silence followed after that, neither the pillar nor Kagaya saying a single word as the weight of those words set in. Shinobu herself had only heard tales, supposedly dating all the way back to the first breath users. But this couldn't be right. That was hundreds of years ago, and even if it was true, the style would have long died off by then. Is that so? Kagaya asked, finally breaking the silence. Despite not still facing him, Shinobu knew from his tone alone that the man was smiling. Shinobu. We might have just found a very interesting person. His head tilted up, as if he was staring up into the sky, even when Shinobu knew that was not the case. Tell me. What is the young demon slayer's name? I believe it was. She paused for a moment to recollect. Tanjiro. Tanjiro Kamado. Tanjiro Kamado, huh? Kagaya chuckled, almost excitedly. An interesting person indeed. Maybe even someone to change the tides in this war we've been fighting for so long. I'm curious to find out what kind of demon slayer this one truly is. End chapter 6. Hope you all enjoyed the fanfic. What if and if ya did, then like, comment, and subscribe for more.